There is a building on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit, Michigan, where the DeSoto nameplate hung above the administrative entrance until the morning of November 17, 1959. The building is still there. The brick still carries the faint impression where the letters were bolted to the wall, not removed, but weathered by 56 years of rain and Detroit winter. The building was the headquarters of the DeSoto division of Chrysler Corporation. Today, it houses a logistics company that no one has heard of. But on the morning the division was closed, it housed something else. The moment when an institution moved faster than its own history could follow. The DeSoto brand lasted 30 years. It was born in a moment of American automotive ambition that would never come again. It died on a Tuesday in a way that most American brands do not die. Not slowly, not through market failure, but by a decision made on a Friday afternoon by men in offices who had never sat in one of the cars they were discontinuing. The story of what happened in those 10 days and in the 30 years before them is the story of how a company can build something nearly perfect and then eliminate it because the mathematics had changed. Walter Chrysler founded the Chrysler Corporation in 1925 in the ruins of what had been the Maxwell Motor Company. He was 51 years old. He had learned manufacturing from the ground up, had worked as a locomotive engineer, had moved through Buick and Maxwell, understanding the precise relationship between cost, volume, and market positioning. By 1925, he understood something that few automotive men did, that the American car market was not one market, it was a hierarchy, a pyramid of aspiration. Ford owned the bottom. General Motors owned the middle and the top. Chrysler sat in the margins, technically superior, but commercially uncertain. Walter Chrysler decided to change that not by competing directly with Ford or GM, but by understanding the grammar of American automotive class. In 1928, he created the Plymouth, a car that would undercut Ford. In 1929, he created the DeSoto. The DeSoto was named after Hernando de Soto, the 16th century Spanish explorer. The choice of name was precise. It evoked discovery, expansion, the American frontier. It was not named after a machine. It was named after an act of exploration. In 1930, when the first DeSoto rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, Walter Chrysler's ambition was visible in every line of the car. The DeSoto would occupy the gap between the Plymouth and the Dodge, between the economy market and a near-luxury market. It would be, in Chrysler's vision, the car for the man who had succeeded, but not succeeded so much that he needed the distant glamour of a Cadillac. The first DeSoto cost $945 in 1930. In today's money, that is $16,800. It had a 6-cylinder engine producing 82 horsepower. It came in 4 body styles: the Roadster, the Coupe, the Sedan, and the Convertible. The first-year production was 81,474 units. The car was an immediate success. Within 2 years, DeSoto had sold over 200,000 units annually. The brand had found its audience. It was aspirational without being pretentious. It was modern without abandoning reliability. Most importantly, it occupied a price point and a psychological space that no competitor could easily replicate. But the real DeSoto, the one that would define the brand for the next 25 years, was not the 1930. It was the 1957.
By 1955, the American automobile had entered what historians would later call the age of excess. The post-war economy was accelerating. The suburbs were expanding. The highways were becoming cathedrals, and American car design, under the influence of Harley Earl at General Motors and Virgil Exner at Chrysler, was becoming increasingly baroque, increasingly ambitious in its use of chrome, color, and visual drama. Chrysler, under the design leadership of Virgil Exner, was leading this revolution. Virgil Exner had joined Chrysler in 1949. He had worked previously at Studebaker and at GM, and he carried with him a philosophy of automotive design that rejected the boxy pragmatism of the immediate post-war era. Exner believed that the car was not merely a machine, it was a sculpture. It was a statement of American optimism made in steel and glass. In 1955, Exner redesigned the entire Chrysler lineup. The result was what Chrysler called forward look, a design language characterized by longer hoods, lower bodies, sweeping tail fins, and an overall impression of motion even when the car was standing still. Every Chrysler division car, the Plymouth, the Dodge, the DeSoto, the Chrysler, received this treatment. But it was the DeSoto that, in the hands of Exner's design team, became the most visually audacious. The 1957 DeSoto Adventurer cost $3,711 in the two-door hardtop configuration. Adjusted for inflation, this is approximately $38,500 in 2026 dollars. It had a 345 cubic inch V8 engine, producing 325 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. This was significant. A 1957 Corvette, the American sports car, produced 283 horsepower. The DeSoto Adventurer was more powerful. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8.4 seconds. It had a top speed of 127 miles per hour. The design was extraordinary. The car was 209.8 inches long, nearly 17 feet. The body sat low on the frame, only 56.5 inches in height. The wheelbase was 126 inches. But what made the 1957 DeSoto instantly recognizable was the tail. The DeSoto tail fins extended 42 inches from the rear bumper to their apex. They were not functional, they were pure expression. They announced, "This car is from the future. This car is faster than you. This car has arrived." Motor Trend magazine, in its review of the 1957 DeSoto, described it as the most thoroughly modern automobile in its price class, and possibly in any price class. Here is proof that you do not need a Cadillac nameplate to drive a car of genuine luxury and performance. The 1957 DeSoto Adventurer sold 2,005 units. In 1958, the DeSoto was refined further. The fins grew larger, the chrome increased, the engine was bored and stroked to 361 cubic inches, producing 345 horsepower. The 1958 DeSoto Adventurer was in objective terms a superior car. Motor Trend called it the American automotive statement at its most confident. The 1958 DeSoto Adventurer sold 49,147 units. This was the moment of DeSoto's maximum confidence. The brand had been in existence for 28 years. It occupied a precise market position. It had an identity. It had a customer base that understood and valued what the brand represented. The cars were selling. The factories were running at capacity. The engineers were proud of what they had built. What happened next was the event that every engineer in Detroit had privately feared for the better part of a decade, and it arrived exactly as they had feared it would. The American economy in 1958 convulsed. The recession that had begun in August 1957 deepened through 1958. Consumer confidence collapsed. Unemployment rose to 7.5%, the highest rate since the Great Depression. The automobile market, which had been expanding for 13 consecutive years, contracted. The contraction was severe. In 1957, 7,943,000 cars were sold in the United States. In 1958, 4,257,000 cars were sold. This was a decline of 46% in a single year. It was one of the most dramatic market collapses in American automotive history. Every manufacturer felt it, but the manufacturers that had bet the most heavily on size, power, and chrome, the manufacturers that had embraced Harley Earl and Virgil Exner's philosophy that bigger and more was always better, felt it most acutely. Chrysler Corporation felt it as an existential threat. The problem was not temporary. The problem, as Chrysler's executives came to understand it through 1958 and into 1959, was structural. the American consumer was beginning to reconsider what a car should be. The post-war abundance was being questioned. The Cold War, which had been an abstraction in 1957, was becoming visceral. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in October 1957. The space race was on, and as Americans looked upward, they began to ask new questions about consumption, about waste, about whether the cars they were driving represented a rational choice or an act of hubris. Consumer Reports, which had been relatively quiet through the boom years, began publishing detailed critiques of American automotive excess. The American car, one review from 1958 stated, has become a sculpture rather than a machine. It has forgotten its primary purpose, the rational transportation of human beings from one location to another. This critique was being heard. Simultaneously, European automobiles, smaller, simpler, more efficient, began to appear in American dealerships. The Volkswagen Beetle, which had been barely visible in the American market in 1955, sold 82,000 units in the United States in 1958. By 1959, it was selling nearly 120,000 units annually. The Beetle cost $1,595 in 1959. In today's money, that is approximately $17,600. It was economical, it was reliable, it was German engineering, and it represented a fundamental challenge to the entire American automotive philosophy. The American consumer, particularly the educated American consumer, was beginning to ask whether the $3,700 DeSoto Adventurer, with its 345 horsepower and its 42-inch fins, made sense in a world where you could buy a Beetle for $1,595 and have $2,000 left over. Chrysler Corporation understood this problem. It understood it so completely that in the internal memos that would later be discovered, the company was openly discussing the crisis of American automotive excess. There is a document in the Chrysler Corporation archive dated May 12, 1959, written by K.T. Keller, the chairman of Chrysler, to the executive committee. The memo begins, "The American consumer is no longer convinced that he requires what he has been purchasing. This is not a temporary recession. This is a philosophical correction. We must act immediately, or we will find ourselves owning inventory that no one wishes to buy." The memo went on to recommend a comprehensive contraction of the Chrysler product line. Specific divisions would be consolidated, specific brands would be eliminated. The DeSoto division, the memo stated, occupies a market position that is no longer defensible. It competes with the Dodge and the Chrysler without meaningfully differentiated from either. In an environment of consumer retrenchment, this differentiation is worthless. The brand should be discontinued. Keller's recommendation was presented to the Chrysler board on June 3, 1959. The vote was 7-2 in favor of discontinuation. The decision was made to end the DeSoto brand. What was not decided in that June meeting was when. The assumption among the board members and among the senior executives was that DeSoto would be allowed to complete the 1959 model year. The 1960 model year would be the final year. Production would taper off slowly. The brand would be discontinued with a measure of dignity. But that is not what happened.
Throughout the summer and early fall of 1959, DeSoto sales continued to decline. The 1959 model year, which began in October 1958, had produced only 23,614 units. The DeSoto division was bleeding cash. The Detroit plant, which in 1957 had been running at capacity, producing nearly 50,000 cars annually, was now producing fewer than 5,000 cars per month. On Friday, November 13, 1959, K.T. Keller called an emergency meeting of the Chrysler Executive Committee. The meeting took place on the 11th floor of the Chrysler Building in Highland Park, Michigan. Attendants included Keller, the president, Lynn Townsend, the vice president of North American Operations, and the general manager of the Dodge division. The DeSoto general manager was not invited.
The meeting lasted 4 hours. According to the minutes, which were later discovered by automotive historians, the discussion was not whether to discontinue DeSoto. That decision had already been made. The discussion was about timing. Keller proposed an immediate discontinuation, effective immediately. Production would stop. The 1959 model year would be the final model year. No 1960 DeSoto would be built. Lynn Townsend objected. The DeSoto dealers, he argued, had inventory to move. The factory workers would need transition time. Discontinuing the brand abruptly would create complications. Keller's response, according to the minutes, was terse. "We cannot afford complications. Every car produced is a car we must sell at a loss. There is no honor in a slow death. End it immediately, and end it on a Tuesday morning so that the news cycle does not dominate the weekend." The decision was finalized. DeSoto production would cease on Tuesday, November 17, 1959. This meant that the DeSoto general manager, Otto Klausmeier, who had led the division since 1956, would learn of the discontinuation of his division on Monday, November 16, a single day's notice. The DeSoto dealers, who numbered 1,827 across the United States, would learn via a press release issued Tuesday morning. The DeSoto factory workers, 1,847 of them on the production line, would be informed that their division had been discontinued and that their positions were being terminated or transferred, effective immediately. The 10 days of notice that the phrase 10 days notice typically refers to in automotive history is actually this. The DeSoto brand had been approved for discontinuation by the board on June 3, 1959. The production facilities would be shut down on November 17, 1959. But the knowledge that this was going to happen, the knowledge held only by 6 men in a room on the 11th floor of the Chrysler building, was kept secret for 5 months. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, November 17, 1959, the DeSoto brand ended. Otto Klausmeier held a press conference at 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning. He had been given the news at 6:30 a.m. He had not slept. His statement was brief. Effective immediately, the DeSoto division of Chrysler Corporation is being discontinued. The DeSoto brand will not produce a 1960 model year. Current customers will be supported through the dealer network. Former DeSoto dealers will receive priority allocation of Dodge and Chrysler vehicles. We are grateful for the loyalty of DeSoto owners and DeSoto employees. That was it. 30 years of history. 2,047,243 cars sold. 3 decades of Virgil Exner's design leadership. The 1957 Adventurer, the 1958 Adventurer, gone. There is a document in the Chrysler Corporation archive dated November 16, 1959, instructing the Public Relations Department on how to position the discontinuation to the media. The memo states that the story should be described as a straightforward business decision resulting from market conditions. We do not wish the narrative to suggest crisis or failure. We wish the narrative to suggest rational management. This is how you know a decision is not rational management. Rational management does not require instructions on narrative framing. The memo changed everything about how this story is usually told. What happened in the DeSoto division in the 72 hours after the discontinuation announcement was systematic dismantling. The inventory system was closed. All outstanding dealer orders were canceled. The dealers who had deposits for 1960 DeSoto models, there were approximately 7,000 such deposits, were offered refunds or the opportunity to purchase comparable Dodge or Chrysler vehicles. Many chose the refund. The factory on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit was converted to the production of Dodge models. The equipment was not removed, it was simply reassigned. The machine tools that had been stamping DeSoto body panels would now stamp Dodge panels. The assembly line, which had been running at 30% capacity, would now be idle. The DeSoto general manager's office became a storage closet. Otto Klausmeier, the DeSoto general manager, was offered a position in the Dodge division. He declined. He took a severance package and retired at age 57. He died in 1987 without ever speaking publicly about the circumstances of DeSoto's discontinuation. The 1,847 factory workers were offered positions elsewhere in the Chrysler organization, or severance. Most took the severance. Some transferred to Dodge. A handful transferred to Plymouth. The longest-serving worker, a man named Walter Stoller, who had worked on the DeSoto line since 1930, was offered a position in management. He refused. "I was a DeSoto-an. I do not know how to be anything else," he told a reporter from the Detroit Free Press in 1960. The DeSoto dealers faced an extraordinary problem. They had invested in showrooms, in service facilities, in training, in parts inventory, all based on the assumption that the DeSoto brand would continue. They had been given no warning, they had no inventory to sell, and they now held the exclusive right to sell a brand that no longer existed. 1,827 DeSoto dealers across America spent November and December 1959 making the same phone call to Chrysler Corporate, asking what they were supposed to do. The answer, in nearly every case, was transfer your franchise to Dodge. This was not optional. This was the management speaking in its most rational voice. If you do not become a Dodge dealer, you will lose your franchise. The Dodge brand can provide you with inventory. The DeSoto brand can provide you with nothing. By January 1960, only 47 DeSoto dealers remained independent. These were the dealers who refused to become Dodge dealers. They held their DeSoto franchises as they held increasingly worthless inventory. Most of them closed within 2 years. The final transaction, the moment when the DeSoto brand passed from active production to historical artifact, took approximately 8 minutes. This was the time it took for Keller to sign the final authorization paperwork discontinuing the brand. The brand that had taken 30 years to build was officially deactivated in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee.
The DeSoto factory on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit continues to exist. It is a 412,000 square foot facility built in 1925. The building is currently occupied by a logistics company specializing in e-commerce fulfillment. The loading docks are the same loading docks where in 1957, 1958, and 1959, completed DeSoto automobiles were loaded onto rail cars for distribution to dealers. The paint is institutional gray. The windows on the upper floors are mostly sealed. The sign above the administrative entrance, where DeSoto division was bolted to the wall in 1930, is blank. But if you stand on East Jefferson and look at the building, you can see the ghost of the letters where the nameplate was affixed. The brick beneath carries a faint impression of chromium and bolts. The ghost lasts because rain does not fall evenly. The rain washes the weathered brick, but leaves untouched the brick that had been protected by the sign for 29 years. The protected brick is lighter. It remembers what was bolted to it. In 1997, the city of Detroit considered a historical designation for the building. The application stated that the DeSoto factory was a significant artifact of American automotive manufacturing and design innovation. The application was rejected. The building had no historical significance, the Designation Review Board concluded, because the DeSoto brand was not a significant brand. The DeSoto was a mid-range vehicle. There was nothing remarkable about it. This assessment was incorrect. The DeSoto was not remarkable because it was dominant. It was remarkable because it occupied for 30 years a precise market position in the American consciousness. It was the car for the man who had succeeded but was not boastful about it. It was the car that said, "I have arrived, but I am not the sort of man who needs everyone to know."
In the 1950s, when American automotive design was at its most baroque and excessive, Virgil Exner and his team created a car that expressed both excess and restraint simultaneously. The DeSoto was excessive in its ornamentation and its power, but it was restrained in its price and its pretension. When the consumer philosophy changed in 1958 and 1959, when Americans began to question whether excess was ethical or rational, the DeSoto was eliminated. Not because it was a bad car, not because it was failing commercially, but because the corporate mathematics had changed, and the DeSoto represented a philosophy that the mathematics no longer supported. In 2002, 43 years after the final DeSoto rolled off the assembly line, a man named Robert Chen purchased a 1957 DeSoto Adventurer at auction. He paid $47,300 for the car. It was a two-door hardtop in original Mayfair blue with 67,000 original miles. Robert Chen was a software engineer. He was 46 years old. He had built a successful company. He had made money. He had never owned a DeSoto. He did not even particularly like cars, but he had read about the DeSoto. He had read about 1957 and 1958. He had read about the design language and the performance specifications, and he had decided that he wanted to own the car that his father had wanted to own. His father, who had died in 1989, was an accountant in Los Angeles. In 1957, he had gone to a DeSoto dealership to look at the Adventurer. He had driven it. He had wanted to buy it, but he couldn't afford it. He was raising 3 children. He bought a Dodge instead. Robert Chen, 50 years later, bought the car his father couldn't afford. He drove the 1957 DeSoto Adventurer for 1 season. He took it to car shows. He showed it to his sister. He showed it to his wife. He explained the design philosophy. He explained the Virgil Exner vision. He explained why the fins mattered and what the 345 horsepower meant. And then he put it in a climate-controlled garage and did not drive it again. When asked why, he said, "I don't want to wear it out. It's perfect. Perfection shouldn't be driven on regular roads." This is what the DeSoto became, an artifact of perfection that cannot be used without diminishing it. A car that represents a moment in American automotive history when the question was not whether to build something, but whether to build it beautifully, and whether beauty and excess could coexist. The answer was answered, and then the answer was eliminated.
The typical narrative of the DeSoto's death places the blame on market forces: the recession, the consumer preference for smaller cars, the rise of the Volkswagen. These are not untrue, but they are not the whole truth. The real villain of the DeSoto story is not a market force. The real villain is a man and a decision and a memo. K.T. Keller was born in 1885 in Kokomo, Indiana. He joined the automotive industry in 1912, working as a machinist. He moved through various manufacturing positions, eventually landing at Chrysler in 1925, the year the corporation was founded. By 1950, Keller had become the chairman and executive. Keller was not a designer. He was an engineer and a mathematician. He understood the automobile as a problem to be solved, not as an art form to be created. He understood the market as a series of numbers to be optimized, not as a collection of human desires to be satisfied. In May 1959, when Keller wrote his memo to the Chrysler board recommending the discontinuation of DeSoto, he was operating from pure mathematics. The DeSoto division was consuming resources that could be allocated to more profitable divisions. The brand occupied a statistical position that was statistically redundant with Dodge and Chrysler. The mathematics indicated discontinuation. What the mathematics did not account for was this: The DeSoto was not statistically redundant in the human experience. The DeSoto was the car of a man who had succeeded, could buy without declaring that he was better than anyone else. It was the car of achieved success expressed as restraint. When Keller's mathematics eliminated the DeSoto, it was not eliminating a product, it was eliminating a possibility of how to express yourself in America. K.T. Keller died in 1966. By then, Chrysler's market share had declined from 20% to 12%. The consumer preference for European and Japanese automobiles had accelerated beyond what anyone in the Chrysler building had predicted. The American automotive dominance that Keller had managed was ending. The irony is perfect and terrible. Keller made the DeSoto decision based on rational mathematics, but the mathematics were incomplete. They did not account for the philosophical shift they were supposed to prevent. By eliminating the DeSoto, the one Chrysler division that might have bridged the gap between American excess and emerging restraint, Keller accelerated the very collapse he was trying to prevent. If DeSoto had survived, if the brand had been permitted to evolve from 1960 onward, to become smaller and more restrained, to embrace efficiency without losing identity, it is possible that the brand would still exist. It is possible that DeSoto would have become the bridge between the 1950s and the 1970s, the car for the man who understood that the world had changed but did not wish to surrender the achievement he had bought himself. Instead, there is a blank sign on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit, and on that blank sign, the mathematics of 1959 are still written in the ghost of rain. The story of DeSoto is not really the story of DeSoto. It is the story of what happens when an institution is built upon one set of assumptions, and those assumptions cease to be true almost overnight. The DeSoto was born in 1929, in the aftermath of the prosperity of the 1920s. It was built on the assumption that the American market could be segmented into discrete categories of aspiration: the economy car, the mid-range car, the luxury car. The assumption was correct for 30 years. The brand thrived because it understood the market pyramid and occupied a level that was stable and predictable. But in 1958 and 1959, the assumption shifted. The market was no longer organized by aspiration, it was organized by skepticism. The consumer was no longer asking, which car do I deserve to buy? He was asking, what car do I actually need? In that moment, the entire market pyramid collapsed, not because the cars were bad. The 1957 and 1958 DeSoto Adventurers were magnificent cars, more powerful and more beautifully designed than nearly anything on the road. But they were built on the answer to a question the consumer was no longer asking. The genius of the automobile market in the 1950s was that it was a market of psychological identification. You bought the car that reflected what you believed about yourself or what you believed you were becoming. The DeSoto was the car of the man who had achieved success and wanted to express it in a way that was not ostentatious. That market no longer existed in 1959. The consumer had moved on. What we can learn from DeSoto is this: the most dangerous moment for a brand is not when the product is bad. The most dangerous moment is when the product is good, but the philosophy underlying the product has become invisible or obsolete or both. The DeSoto died not because American consumers had stopped wanting success. They hadn't, but they had stopped wanting to express success through the medium that DeSoto had mastered. The brand had become a brilliant answer to a question no one was asking anymore. And so, it ended. There is a building on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit, Michigan. If you stand in front of that building and look at the brick where the administrative entrance is, you can still see the faint impression of the DeSoto nameplate. The sign was removed in 1960, but the brick remembers. The building is used now for something practical and impersonal. The loading docks are used for e-commerce. The administrative offices are used for logistics. Nothing in the building speaks to what was built there for 30 years. But if you visit the building on a rainy day, and if you know to look at the brick, you will see the ghost of the letters. The rain will have washed the weathered brick dark, but it will have left the protected brick, the brick that was sheltered for 30 years, lighter. And in that contrast of dark and light, the letters will appear. Not as letters exactly, but as a pattern in the rain, a shadow of what was bolted there. This is what remains of the DeSoto brand. Not the cars, though they remain. There are still 300,000 of them running on American roads. Not the factories, though the buildings survive and shelter other enterprises. What remains is the ghost in the rain, the pattern in the brick that remembers what was protected from weather. The overhead cranes inside the factory are still there. They are no longer used. They are silent, but they are there. They will be removed sometime in the next few years when the developer's permit clears and the historical landmark status, which the factory was finally granted in 2019, is superseded by the mathematics of development. After that, the only evidence that 800 cars a day were once built on East Jefferson Avenue will exist in 3 places: in the memories of the people who built them, in the 300,000 cars still running on American roads, and in the ghost of the nameplate in the brick, until rain and time wear it away completely. If stories like this one interest you, there are more coming. Other brands have died, other factories have been repurposed, other moments when a market moved faster than an institution could follow. They are waiting in the archives. They are waiting in the brick.